Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the 7th season finale, my interview guest is the author of the Tesha series of historical fantasy novels set in Bronze Age Anatolia, as well as Hand of Fire, also an historical fantasy novel set in the Bronze Age. Her name is Judith Starkston, and here's my interview with Judith. Judith Starkston, welcome to Apollo Papyrus.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I am the author of historical fantasy. The series is the Tesha series. The most recent fourth and final of the series is Flights of Treason. It's just come out. My world building is inspired by the Hittite Empire, which is one of the lost empires of history in the 13th century BCE. And I let the magic that those people thought was part of their world actually go for it.
You are the author of the Tesha series of historical fantasy novels, as you mentioned moments ago. And I'll start with the first 3 novels in the series without spoiling too much of your first 3 novels in that series: Princess of Ishana, Sorcery in Alpara, and Of Kings and Griffins. What are they about?
Well, they are inspired by the life of an actual Hittite queen. And it's the early sort of her rise to power. She started out life as a priestess of the goddess of love and war. In the beginning, in that first book, it's part murder mystery and part royal intrigue. She meets a man that she is quite taken with, who is the younger brother of the great king. And then it turns out he's accused of sorcery, very dangerous sorcery, which she then must undo with the priestly magic that she knows. And it goes on from there. By the end of the 4th book, she has gone from a very tentative and reluctant use of magic, and she is considerably more of a sorcerer herself. And it is about her rise to in this empire to the position of queen.
Okay, on May 7th, the 4th book in your Tesha historical fantasy series, Flights of Treason, was released. Without spoiling too much of Flights of Treason, could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, it is. I'm wondering, but So it is a moment in this woman's. She is a vassal queen. She's not ruling the empire or anything. Her husband is the uncle of the great king, and Tesha thinks of it as balancing on a blade of a royal dagger, because the nephew who is ruling has taken a number of actions against them to control their power, limit them, and harm their family. And at that is the moment at which the novel begins. And they do their best to avoid open conflict and civil war. And they may or may not succeed. And they may or may not have to take greater action than they would like to, given that it's family.
What inspired you to write fantasy novels set in Bronze Age era Anatolia?
Well, I started thinking about the Hittites, who are, when I was writing a book, my first novel is Hand of Fire, and it's set in the Trojan War. So a different series, but turns out to be the same time period and same culture, because the Trojans are, we have discovered in the last couple decades of archaeology and exploration of this ancient culture that has come to light, we realize now that the Trojans and that the whole area of what's today modern Turkey and Syria, actually both countries, was part of this big Hittite empire. Troy would have been sometimes a vassal kingdom and sometimes an independent but culturally related kingdom. So while I was figuring out how to write the material, the world of Troy and make that vivid and alive, so I was exploring the Hittites, I found out that the Hittites had this queen who ruled for decades. She was remarkable. She was highly respected in her own time period. But again, this was just something that, when I was in college and doing graduate work in the ancient world, nobody talked about this. It was not something that we had figured out really yet. So that was just too appealing. And I thought, this is a woman who would be a household name like Elizabeth I or Cleopatra or somebody like that, who are much more modern people, but than she is. But she needed to be brought to life for a popular, in fiction in a way that's fun and engaging. And because she believed in so much magic, I gradually, as I was writing the series, realized, I should just let this magic happen. And it became increasingly fantastic.
On your author website, which I'll include a link to in the text description of this episode once it's uploaded, you have an authentic history section about the real life history of Bronze Age Anatolia, the Hittite civilization in the ancient Near East. How much research did you do about the history of ancient Anatolian/Hittite civilization, and why was it important for your writing of the Tesha series?
I have spent a couple decades, a lot of time. The history of the Hittites is it's largely archaeological. So, reading raw archaeological reports on various sites and there are big libraries of cuneiform tablets that in the mid 20th century got deciphered, and then we are still working on translations of them. And all of that is not super accessible. If I didn't have degrees in classics, I wouldn't be able to access most of that very successfully. So it was a large research project. And then the real job is absorbing that information so that, I can wind it and weave it into effective storytelling, which needs to be much less, you can't overburden it with a whole lot of cool archaeological facts. For those who are really interested in archaeology and all of that, I have a weekly blog that you can subscribe to on my website, and that I fill with what's going on in archaeology of the ancient world. But so it's always a juggling act. I think sometimes I know almost more than I should about these people, and keeping that from overburdening the tale.
In the historical world of your fiction, what power or restrictions did women live with?
Much less than you would think. It was very much a patriarchal culture. Men were the keepers of power for the most part. But unlike, say, a Victorian woman who had no right to property or her own control of her own body or anything, Hittite women had the right to get a divorce, to initiate one. They could keep their children in a divorce situation. This woman, when she was a queen and her husband died, she carried on, and that was according to Hittite law. They would appoint another king, but her power was independent of that. They owned property. She was a literate woman, and there were many other literate women who were priestesses. I suspect it was not 50-50 literacy rates among men and women, but it was a very highly rare skill anyway. It took a lot to acquire it, reading cuneiform and being able to read and write. But so there was much more legal leeway for women. But as with the United States today, and we think, women legally are not, theoretically have all the powers of men. But the reality is that they are constantly navigating around male dominance in the culture. And so that was, so part of what interested me in writing about this queen was that she was doing that same project of being powerful in a world that legally she could do that, but in fact, typically, I mean, she's one of the very few Hittite queens who exercised power like this, and she's the only one who exercised power in a really productive, effective way. I mean, she created a kind of miniature golden age right at the end of the Hittite Empire. After her, her son and grandson rule, and then the entire empire collapses. Part of this larger Bronze Age empire collapse that happened at that point. It wasn't exclusive to the Hittites, but she had real skills as a ruler, and I wanted to bring those to people.
The magic in your novels is based on the beliefs of Bronze Age era Anatolia. What are some of the strangest of these beliefs?
Well, in the first book that you were, Priestess of Ashana, that you brought up, the central premise of the plot there is that there was this curse, and that the Hittites had a really strong, they were obsessed with this idea that that people could use magic, sorcery, to inflict others with curses. And it tended to be things like they would send illness, a evil sorcerer could send illness to another person. The queen was often a target of that. Not this queen in particular, but queens in general, as you look at the literature about their letters and their rights to protect people. Crops could be damaged. So things that we would attribute to, something else, science or medicine or whatever, they saw as being caused by curses. And she was trained in how to get rid of those curses and how to undo them. And one of the tools she uses in this very first book, when she has to go in, there's this burnt corpse, and she has to purify it so that this pollution that's killed this man won't spread and cause more death and more destruction. And the tool she uses is a loaf of bread that has chickpea paste in it, like hummus, like the dip.
I'm going to have to decline a phone call. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the previous question. The magic in your novels is based on the beliefs of Bronze Age era Anatolia. What are some of the strangest of these?
So they believed in that one of the things that they were obsessed with in the realm of magic was curses. They thought that there were people of bad will, sorcerers, who could curse a queen or create illness in another person. And the very beginning of my first novel that opens with a dead body who has been burned by a curse. They are, and this priestess, has to go and undo it, because that is a very dangerous. They saw all of things like curses as breaking the harmony of the world, and you had to keep things in harmony. So the rules of the fantasy the magic in my series is based on these basic notions that they had. And in order to do that, she has to draw away the pollution from this corpse that is there, that has been killed with bad magic. And she uses, it's such a bizarre notion to us, but the tool she uses is a loaf of bread that's got chickpea paste in it, and hummus in essence, like the dip we eat. And that's the absorbent material. And then she applies it puts the loaf of bread to the dead body, to this really horrific corpse. And she has to remove it with a silver shovel, because silver was the metal of purity, and she could keep it from polluting herself. She burns it up, and then you bury it in this sacred cave near a spring, where the water will wash it into the underworld, where it can be restrained. There's an entire world underneath the earth with a sun goddess of the world below. And it's not like a hell. It's not like a dark and terrible place. But those gods underneath are they're fairly vindictive, and they are pretty frightening. And in any case, they are the best place to store away dangerous things like curses. So they all get stored down there. So that's a good example of the way they thought magically, and how I use it. I mean, frankly, I don't know how anyone could make up something like this loaf of bread with hummus. So it's really fun to use what they actually did. And then, because I let that magic actually work as magic, it flares into imagination.
Before the Tesha series was published, you wrote Hand of Fire. Without spoiling too much about that book, what is it about?
It is told from the point of view of Briseis, who is the young captive woman that Achilles has taken in battle. And then he and the other the most powerful of the Greek kings, Agamemnon, fight over her when Agamemnon takes her away from Achilles. And I had always been intrigued, because she is described in the Homeric poem, the Iliad, as going all unwillingly. And I thought, well, wait a minute. He has Achilles. Why would she be unwilling to leave Achilles? He's killed her husband and her brothers. He has, turned her into a captive slave from being a princess and queen. So I was just curious, who was she and who was Achilles, that there could actually be a genuine love between these two, because the story just doesn't seem plausible. So I was exploring that question. And that's fundamentally, the novel is a lot about the resilience of women within warfare, and violence against women. And it's very much, there are a number of novels right now that have been published since Hand of Fire was published, that are exploring the women of Troy, and a kind of feminist look at that war. And mine was one of those, the first, actually. Not the first, but one of the earliest in this current renaissance of novels.
You consider yourself a professional self-publisher. What does that mean, and why did you choose the independent publishing route?
I started out being published by a small press. Hand of Fire originally came out as a small press. And after I was actually, I was teaching at a workshop. I do a lot of teaching of writing, and I was teaching at a San Diego Writers Conference, and what the keynote speaker and I got in a conversation, and he by the end of the evening said, I want to represent you. He was an agent. And so I have an agent. He's retired. We haven't been conversing lately, but he took my manuscripts out to market, and they were, like, that was a long process. It's, everybody thinks that just get an agent and everything will be easy and fall in your lap. And that is never, I think it's almost never the case. It's still a project. And what I heard back was that from various agents various editors, that they saw the Hittite-based fiction as a very niche market, which is 100% true. I mean, I work to get people intrigued. Once they start reading my books, they love them, and then there's no problem. They, carry on through. But so when I heard that, and people were very hesitant to put much marketing into it. I had already been published by a small press. I knew that losing all ability to track where your sales are going, you can't market very effectively, and you can, they created a ugly original edition. I didn't like the physical book very much. So I just said, you know what? I happened that year to be going through treatment for cancer. And I just said, what's going to give me joy in life is being able to keep this book and all of the ones that follow in the series, and not have some big press say, that first book, we didn't sell enough, we're killing it, and goodbye. And there was only one of these queens. I wasn't going to be able to come up with something else right away, so I just published it myself. I have never regretted that. I work very hard to make sure I get my novels thoroughly edited, in a variety of ways, but on all the levels that need to be developmental and copy and line and all of those things, which sadly, most of my friends who are traditionally published these days get very little editing. So you can do that much more thoroughly for yourself by hiring it as a self-published author. And I work very hard to have the actual physical book, the cover art, and the layout and all be quite beautiful. And I hire the cover art out.
How do you juggle history and imagination as you write?
Basically, the world building, the physical setting, I try to make as accurate and as much a deep dive into that world. So if people are just interested in history and they read my books, they can count on the world building to be accurate. And my friends who are the actual historians of this period, the academic sort of people, enjoy my books and are, say, yes, you in fact, you do that. So, and the major plot events that happened to this woman and to her family and to the royal families and the various empires that attack her and all. Her primary enemy was Ramses II of Moses fame. So that kind of puts it in maybe what feels more familiar to people. The major events of her life that we know, and of course there are huge gaps in what we know, I keep those. So that skeleton operates as the skeleton in which I form the fictional novels. But of course, I, for example, have Griffin's fantastical beasts. I got those from all the artwork of this realm. So it's not like the Hittite kingdom and surrounding peoples all had these hybrid creatures of lion and eagle, but obviously they don't, they're not real in the world, not as far as we know, but they are in my novel. So I juggle those two things. So the world is real, the basic timeline of her and events of her life are real. A lot of the big battle that takes place at the end of Flights of Treason is based on an archaeological site, very precisely. So like all of the engineering tools, the sources of water and the way the ground's laid out that affects the battle and all of those things, the kind of fortification walls, I drew those all from reality. But then I also have 3 sorcerers who are battling within this same battle. So I think it's pretty clear where the fantasy and the history to a reader, and I have really accurate author notes at the end. So for people who really care, they can always tell where one begins and where one ends. But they're much more fun as novels because of that expansion into a more imaginative approach.
What are some things you learned about writing books while writing the Tesha series that you wish you had known while writing Hand of Fire or when you started writing the Tesha series?
Well, I have certainly learned how to take, backstory. When you're writing a series, you get one or two books in, beyond the first book, you have to cue your readers to enough about what happened in the first or the second or the third or all three of them so that they're not lost. And yet, so that people can just pick up any one of the books they want and start where they want, because often readers do. And in the case of my series, since it's she's reluctant to take on magic and it comes on gradually. If you're really interested in full-flown fantasy and sorcery, you would probably start at the end. So learning how to deal with that backstory and not slow the pace. And I didn't know how to do that in the beginning. And I know with Hand of Fire, the first developmental editor I had said, well, I think you should chop off the first 7 chapters. And that was, kind of a shock to hear that then. But after, a little while of thinking about it, it's like, yeah, you're right. That was all information about the character backstory, about Briseis that I needed to know. And little bits of it might go much later in the novel where a reader really feels the need for it. But to load it up in the beginning is certainly not where it belonged. And so I learned as I went how to thread in just the right amount of backstory and to mostly keep it out of the very first few chapters so that the pacing grabs you and pulls you in. And then when you really want to know something, only then to hear it.
Judith, that was the final interview I have for season 7. I thank you for appearing on Apollo Papyrus. It was wonderful to interview you, and I look forward to interviewing more guests next season.
Well, thank you very much.
It was wonderful to cap off this season of the podcast with an interview with Judith. Before I wrap up this season of the podcast, I have a few things to tell y'all about. I have permanently shut down the Apollo Papyrus newsletter on Substack, as here in a few days I will be launching the brand new Apollo Campfire newsletter on Substack. Apollo Campfire will be my new home for my opinion, analysis, and review articles about writing and books, as well as articles about other topics such as politics and sports, among others. I'll include a link to Apollo Campfire in the text description of this episode. Apollo Papyrus will continue in its podcast and YouTube channel forms, and sometime in the next few days, the name of this podcast will be changing slightly to Apollo Papyrus Podcast. This is to differentiate the Apollo Papyrus podcast and YouTube channel from each other, and the YouTube channel will be renamed again slightly to Apollo Papyrus Channel around the same time. Additionally, there has been a slight change in the URL for the Apollo Papyrus Facebook page, and I will include an updated link in the text description. The 8th season of the Apollo Papyrus podcast will begin later this month. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write and read your passion. Until next season, goodbye. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.